Hey guys, so I'm gonna quickly cover a few specific ways to test your gasoline engine. Each one's a little bit different. I'm not gonna get too specific. Just go over the general reasons why you'd use each test. Okay, here we go. All right. So hooking this up, the first one that we're gonna really talk about is the vacuum gauge. Now this obviously isn't for testing an engine. This one is just a vacuum gauge that I have just to show you the gauge. But with the vacuum gauge, it's really simple to set up because all you have to do is connect the vacuum gauge over to the intake manifold. And as you can see, the intake manifold's right here past the throttle body. And on certain cars, there's just easy places just to hook it up and then you're tapped into your vehicle's vacuum. There's certain ways to test this one: idle, at drive, at operating temperature, and under load. In the PowerPoint, you guys will see that depending on how many inches of mercury and if it's, fluctuating rapidly or rhythmically, yeah, you can kind of tell what's wrong with the engine. One thing with the vacuum test, though, is that you can't really single out which cylinder is the culprit with the vacuum test. The next one is a cylinder power balance test. Now with this one, it's very straightforward. It's usually done with a scan tool to disable either the spark or the fuel injection. But with the cylinder power balance test, what you really do is you turn the engine on, have it running, and then you can deactivate one cylinder at a time, and you just kind of measure the difference in RPM speed. Difference in RPM speed should be the same for each cylinder, but you can test a weak cylinder by if you deactivate one cylinder and there's very little to no change, hey, that's your problem cylinder. So a cylinder power balance test is really good at singling out, which cylinder is the culprit on your engine. The next one is a really good test. It's the compression test. There's a few different ways to test compression. To start out, I'll just go with the first one, cranking. With the cranking compression test, what you do is you take out all of your spark plugs, you unplug all of the fuel injection system, and then you hook up the compression tester to one of the spark plugs for the cylinder that you want to the spark plug, placement for the cylinder that you want to troubleshoot. Now, with the compression test, the cranking test, after you've disabled injectors, all the spark plugs are removed, you make the throttle wide open so that plenty of air can get in, and then you crank the engine over and it will just try to crank and crank and crank, and you want that to go for at least 4 compression strokes so you can get a good read on the compression test. Now this is good for letting you know if you have a weak cylinder in one or the other, or if they're all about the same. It's hard to pinpoint where the problem is, though, if you have a problem cylinder. That's why you have the wet compression test. The wet compression test pinpoints the cause of the low cranking test that I talked about performing earlier. With the wet compression test, all you do is through the spark plug hole, you put a tablespoon of 30 weight engine oil. And when you put in the engine oil and you crank it over, if the compression stays about the same, the rings are not that the rings are not the problem, but it's probably the valves that are the culprit. But if compression gets better when you put in that oil, that means that is helping the rings seal up better, so the rings are weak. The next compression test is a running test. This is just great for checking the breathing ability of the engine with it running. Okay. The next test I'm going to talk about is a cylinder leakage test. Instead of checking for compression with a cylinder leakage test, we are actually going to blow air. We're going to hook this up to an air compressor, and we're going to blow air through the same spark plug hole to test leakage through the cylinders. This helps you pinpoint which cylinder is the problem. You test on one cylinder at a time. Generally speaking, less than 20% leakage is acceptable for most vehicles. Let me just check. Okay, you want to do this at operating temperature and when each cylinder is at its own top dead center, so you can really get a test of that leakage. How you figure out where the problem is with this leakage test is that you just listen for air coming out. So if you hear air coming out through the oil dipstick or through here, you know it could be bad rings. If you hear air coming out of the intake manifold, hey, you know it's the intake valve. And the same thing with if you hear air coming out through the exhaust. Okay, that's that cylinder leakage test. Really good tool. Next, we're going to talk about block check dye. And so with block check dye, it's really good for diagnosing if you are having a combustion leak into the cooling system via the head gasket, a cracked head, or a cracked block down below. With that, what you do is you undo the radiator cap, and what you'll want to do is you want to drain the radiator fluid so it's not full, but it's 2 to 3 inches below this, because you're not checking the coolant itself, you're just checking the fumes that are in the coolant with this block check dye. So with that, you can get a dye kit and all that, and you put it into the cooling system and run the engine. I'm not going to talk about how to perform the block check dye test because I don't have one, but with it, it has the dye, and over the course of a minute, if the dye that you put into this while the coolant is 2 to 3 inches low, if it changes from blue to green then yellow in the course of a minute, so if it changes all the way to yellow, you know you have a combustion leak somewhere. Head gasket, the cracked head, or cracked block. But you can't really pinpoint which one it is unless you see visual signs through this test, because it's just checking for the general fumes but not actually the source like some other tests do. So that is just a general overview of testing a gasoline engine. Hope you guys enjoy it, and yeah, good luck on the test.